And away we go. Well, hello everyone out there. It's wonderful to be with you. My name is John Lustria. I'm the education coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We're joined by my colleague, Jake Wynn, the bearded one, our director of interpretation at the museum, and of course, Braeden Bumpers of McClintock Distilling. They brewed for us the reason why we're all here tonight, Remedy Rye, which you're going to hear a lot more about in great detail in just a little bit. So thank you, those of you who are here with us tonight. If you have any questions throughout, either leave them in the chat, or we'll have some kind of discussion periods at various points. Just go ahead and shout them out. If you're watching this days after the fact, send us an email. We'll be happy to get to any of your questions. And there's Jake in the chat saying hello to everyone. What a friendly guy. So with all that said, thank you, of course, for supporting both of our organizations. A portion of the proceeds go to the museum. A large portion of the proceeds go to McClintock as well, of course. So thank you so much for supporting great local distilling and great local history. And you're going to get a little bit of both as we go through the program here. So for starters, I want to turn things over to Braeden. He'll show us around if you're unfamiliar with McClintock. Well, I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but he's going to go in depth here. So take us away, Braeden.
Very cool. Yeah, we had an absolute blast doing this project, and we really took the time to kind of from start to finish do this as kind of as authentic a rye whiskey as you would have found in a battlefield med kit as we possibly could. So I'm going to take you guys over to the production floor. And you can see kind of a little bit about how we make our whiskey and the steps that we took to kind of make this as authentic as possible. So I'm going to hop from the computer onto my phone, so I'll be coming up on another screen in a second.
The wonders of technology here.
All right, can everybody see and hear me okay?
You're showing up good for me.
All right, cool. So we're gonna head on over, and grab my rye. So the very first step of making a whiskey, got to start with this. And this is, I'll hold it up a little bit closer. This is rye. Rye is in the same family as wheat. It's a grain. It's used for bread making. But in American history, particularly in Maryland history, we were some of the largest producers of rye whiskey in the world. And so for this project, the first thing we wanted to do was to select a rye that would be true to what you would have found in the 1800s. So we did some research. We used this Danko rye, which is a non-genetically modified traditional heirloom grain. We have 3 farms here in Maryland that grow this using organic practices. So like they would have then, there's no pesticides, no fungicides, no chemicals, harvested and cleaned just kind of the natural way. And we did what's called a Monongahela Rye, which is pretty typical at that time. Nowadays, like if any of you have tried our Bootjack Rye whiskey, that is 75% rye, 20% wheat, and 5% corn. What was very typical back then was just 100% rye. So this is the only ingredient in the remedy that you have there is this non-genetically modified organic grown Danko rye. we thought it was really important to work with local farms on this. I always try to make the winery comparison is, you know, if you go to a winery, all they talk about is their terroir. They won't shut up about it. And we want to take that kind of same approach in that you can grow this rye here in Maryland soil, and we have this clay heavy kind of rocky soil. If anybody's ever tried to dig a ditch, you know what a pain our soil is out here. Not good for growing much, but very good for growing rye. And you could grow this same rye out on the West Coast, and the types of compounds that give you flavors at the end are going to be different. So if we're going to do an authentic Maryland style Monongahela straight rye whiskey, it all starts here. And then the next thing we did, which is something that we are very lucky to have. We're one of a handful of distilleries left in the world that still use stone to mill 100% of our grains right here on site. So we're able to bring in these organic heirloom grains. We turn them into a flour using this machine. If you've ever been to an old water mill or windmill, this works exactly the same. So there's two big granite blocks in here. They're grooved on the inside. They slow grind that grain into a really fine, basically bakery grade flour. And then we deliver them directly into the mash tank here, where we can start breaking them down and processing those starches into sugars, which is what we can make into alcohol. This is truly unique. Almost everybody in the distilling world uses something called a hammer mill, which is a steel on steel, runs on a really fast motor, pulverizes the grain into a really fine flour. It's very efficient. It takes us about 3.5 hours to mill in what a hammer mill could do in about 30 minutes. But one, obviously, in the 1800s, they did not have hammer mills. Pretty much everything was grist milled or stone milled. So this is really creating that flavor that you would have gotten then, which is very unique because there's a lot less friction using stone. It keeps the temperature much lower. We keep a lot more of those natural flavors intact in the grain, and it comes through into the whiskey. So if a lot of you guys have maybe taken a sneak peek before we do our tasting, and you'll notice it's a lot softer. It's not going to be as punchy as a normal rye whiskey. And that's because most of the flavor is coming from the grain that's stone ground, whereas a lot of that will be burned off using a modern day hammer mill. So this is a critically important part of creating that authentic rye whiskey. Over here, we use our mash. If anybody's been to a brewery before, this is pretty much exactly the same. We use heat, we use enzymes, and we use our mill to convert all of those long, complex starches into simple sugars that then are easy for the yeast to eat and turn into ethyl alcohol. And then we bring it over here. So these are our fermenters. We have them built to keep really tight temperature control. We have a bunch of scientific tests we can run on them. And we use a really aggressive distillery yeast strain that is proprietary to us and has been bred through many years. They did not have those in the Civil War. So rather than using our traditional yeast strain, we actually used an ale maker's yeast, which was much more popular. Most whiskey was actually made with brewer's yeast back at that time. So we used the ale making yeast, and because we did this really long, really slow fermentation process, we didn't have to use our cooling, which we normally do, because again, something that definitely would not have been used, and you get this really terrific esterification. You take the long time to develop these complex flavors that you get with an ale making yeast. So basically, we've created a beer at this point. Probably wouldn't want to drink the Remedy Rye mash. It's really made to be distilled. So we take that mash and we'll throw it into our still over here. I'll give you guys a full look at the still behind me here. She's very pretty. This is a very new age still. So we did something kind of special for the Remedy Rye release. Typically, if you've ever seen some of the old school distilleries, you'll see something that looks like this, which is a pot still. We have also a column still here. There's a Kofi still. This was not invented until after the Civil War, unfortunately. So what we did is we did a straight pot distillation of this whiskey. We did not use a rectification column at all. It just goes right into the pot. We distill it straight into the whiskey, condense it and collect it. And then we take that out, we put it back into the still and redistill it one more time, which was very typical for that time. If anybody's ever been to some of those Scotch distilleries that are, 300 and 400 years old, this is how they distill their product, unchanged for a very long time. Normally with our whiskeys, we use the rectification column to clean it up a little bit. It's a little more efficient. But by doing the pure single run pot distillation, you get a tremendous amount of flavor, which is what you get with the Remedy Rye. And then to finish, I have some barrels here that just got filled today. We aged ours in 30-gallon new cooperage white American oak charred barrels. And right around that time, charred whiskey was really kind of at its zenith of popularity. It was still very new at the time. Charring the barrels actually started in the 1700s. So before that, most whiskey was actually just white or aged in toasted oak barrels. So this was all the rage back then. And then normally we filter our whiskey, but for this product, we just put it through a cheesecloth and put it right in the bottle, so it was ready to go. So as you can see, we really tried to put it all of the stops to really stay true to that authentic, Maryland rye whiskey that would have been very, very popular at the time. And it really is thanks to the Civil War and parts of Maryland being on different sides that really gave way to the rise of Maryland rye and popularity across the country after the Civil War, because everybody got a taste for it and people were drinking Maryland style rye in Florida and in Massachusetts and in Missouri and out on the territories and the West at that time. And it's, this is where it all came from. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's such a great kind of tidbit that, also had to be said, the rise of Maryland rye.
Very
I'm sorry.
good.
Everyone collectively groaning in their homes. I apologize. But that's such an interesting point about the Civil War, and especially how Maryland was, there were armies marching through Maryland, throughout the entire conflict. And it was this kind of weird, way to disperse it across the nation and make it increasingly popular. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing I wanted to highlight quickly, I mean, we were talking maybe a month ago or so about this whole process and, how dedicated you all were to, keeping it as close as possible to how they would have done it in the Civil War. And that even some of the farms that you got the rye from quite possibly might have grown rye during the Civil War, like the exact same literal ground that grew the rye could have grown rye both for Civil War era whiskey and for this whiskey, which is such a cool thought.
In fact, the likelihood of that is actually fairly high. If you look at like the old ag reports, especially from Frederick County, where we get a lot of the grain, most of these, I mean, two of our farms, I think, are 5th or 6th generation farmers, all in the same family. They've been growing grain this whole time. And at that time, most people around here were growing rye because, without the kind of genetically massaged corn that we have now, rye is what everybody grew. So, it is cool to think of that, the same ground that was growing rye then is still being used for that again today, which is neat.
Yeah, love that. Anne asked a really good question. How long did you keep it in the barrels?
So we aged this product for almost 3 years, a little over 2.5 years. We actually, at that time, that's actually a little bit longer than was pretty typical for some of the Maryland distilleries. A lot of those kind of longer, older age statements didn't really become that popular until the late 1800s and the early 1900s, when people were looking for that straight, 4, 5, and 6 year whiskey. So a lot of the labels that we've found from old Maryland ryes have, most of them actually don't have any age statement on them, but some of them would be described as like a pale gold in color, which probably puts it somewhere in the 4 month to 8 month mark. So that was a great question.
Yeah, and then just a question for me, just out of my own curiosity, you've obviously done, quite a bit of research as to how something like this would have been made. Where did you go to kind of find some of this information?
So we early on, part of our core mission here is we wanted to restore kind of that lost legacy of Maryland rye and Maryland distilling in general with what we did. Really early on, we worked a lot with the Burkittsville Historical Society because 4 of the biggest distilleries in the state was all in Burkittsville. The A. Horsey Distillery in particular, we sat down with people whose they're about 80 or 90 now, but their fathers and their grandfathers worked at the A. Horsey Distillery because there is, very little primary documentation from any of the distilleries at that time. So we had to go off what these people remembered as the mash bill and kind of recreated that based on what they remembered, based on old plats of, who was growing what where, and the types of grains that would have been typical at that time, and cross-referencing these old ag studies and, people's firsthand accounts and a lot of the information that we got from the both Frederick and Burkittsville Historical Society. So it was really fun, because it's very new. And now I think there's like 1 or 2 people writing books about Maryland rye, and I can't wait to see what they've kind of dug up.
Yeah, that's really cool. And you present it all in such a neat and tidy package, but specifically as a historian, I want to underscore how, intensive and really granular some of that research is to produce something as awesome as this. So I want to sing your praises for everyone else that a lot of work went
very
into
kind
this.
of you.
Does anyone have any questions about the process? Or how this was made? Hearing none, I'm going to throw it over to my colleague, Jake Wynn. He'll talk a little bit about whiskey in the Civil War and how it relates to medicine.
Actually, real quick, I was just curious to see, was there an average ABV back in the Civil War compared to like current day?
Yes, actually, that was a really good question. What was very popular at the time was actually 100 proof. So at that time, everything was taxed by the proof gallon by the federal government. So the very first thing that was taxed after the formation of the United States was distilled spirits. So that, a lot of distilleries would do 100 proof bottled in bond is what it would be called, because that was a really easy way to track it. It was an easy way to keep the feds happy, and they would do it that way. So more often than not, you would see 100 proof whiskey. We dialed it back a little bit because a lot of people that we've seen, especially in the Civil War when resources were just really limited, would start watering down and bringing down their whiskey just to stretch it out a little bit more. So this would have been, especially, as a battlefield, allocation, it would have probably been even lower than 90 proof. We didn't want to do that because you lose a lot of the good flavor when you bring it down that much, but we didn't want to do it as a 100 proof product. The 90 really kind of sings to what would have been, what you probably would have gotten back then. But yeah, more often than not, 100 proof was very, very common in the 18 and 1700s.
And then one other question from Anne. How would you contrast the remedy rye process with the bootjack rye? We're drinking both side by side tonight.
Yes.
So
yes. So the bootjack is going to be a little bit cleaner. It's going to be a little bit softer. Part of that is with the bootjack, we use the rectification column and basically simulate a triple distillation in one pass through. So we get a little bit more out of the grains and a little bit less on the back end, whereas the remedy has a little bit of that kind of like a high alcohol volatility to it. The bootjack is going to be a little bit less than that. The other big difference is the bootjack mash bill is finished with wheat and corn. The wheat is going to give it a little bit more of that kind of the earthiness in the taste, and a little bit more of that kind of soft, almost like butteriness on the palate. And then the corn is going to give it just a hint of that sweetness on the back end. So I find with the boot jack, there's a little bit of almost like I call it like a caramel corn, those little candies that you get. I taste a little bit of that on the back end of the boot jack, whereas the remedy does not have quite so much of that. So that's a great question. But we did it as fun with that one because it's the same proof. We did 90 for both of them. So it's a really good apples to apples tasting there. And you can see what a huge difference it makes for a little tweak in the mash bill and how we're fermenting and distilling it. But
Very cool.
The easiest way to do it, do a nosing of it. That esterification we got from the ale yeast made some really interesting bouquet on the remedy rye.
Very cool. Anne is nodding and giving a thumbs up. So
All right, good.
splendid.
Yeah.
Hearing no other questions here, Jake, do you want to take us away?
All right. Thank you, John. Thank you so much, Braeden. That was fantastic as always. And thank you all so much for your great questions so far this evening. My name is Jake Wynn. I'm the Director of Interpretation at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, which is located just about a block and a half from McClintock Distillery. So we are thrilled to be working with McClintock on this project. This is, as you've heard, been a years-long process. So we're really excited to see it to come to full fruition. And we have worked with McClintock in the past. They've hosted events for us there, and we are grateful to Braeden and the whole team at McClintock for all that they've done on this project and all that they've done for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in the past. This project in particular is kind of the latest and dare I say my favorite in the tasting history series of programs and partnerships that the museum has been conducting since about 2012, since we started doing kind of alcohol and food-based programming and partnerships. This has included beers with a variety of local breweries, including Brewers Alley, Monocacy Brewing Company, Flying Dog Brewery, Antietam Brewery out in Hagerstown, 10th Ward Distilling as well. We've worked with them, and a variety of other restaurant partners that we've worked with, including basically right down the street from McClintock at the Wine Kitchen as well. We very strongly believe in these kinds of opportunities to taste history. So if it's Braeden and his team doing the research and developing a Civil War era whiskey, or if it's Jeff Beard at the Wine Kitchen making Civil War era recipes and food, we believe very strongly in that, having that taste of history to be able to kind of take us back to that previous period and give a modern spin as to make it more palatable, because some of the concoctions that they were cooking up during the mid-19th century are quite frankly pretty terrifying. And that includes beer, whiskey, food, some pretty scary stuff going on in the 19th century. So we are really excited about these kinds of programs. And whiskey is one of the most substances connected with Civil War medicine, right? When we think of Civil War medicine, we're oftentimes thinking of what were surgeons using in the operating rooms of the Civil War, what were Civil War generals taking a swig of before they lead their men into battle and oftentimes to disaster. It's whiskey. And so this is a natural, great partnership and a way to talk about Civil War medicine in an interesting way while y'all are sipping some remedy rye. Whiskey was one of the most prevalent distilled beverages being consumed in the United States at the time of the Civil War. It is as American as America itself. If you go back and follow American history and you follow what folks are drinking in this country and what people are fighting about in this country, it always tends to come back to whiskey. And go back to the Whiskey Rebellion in Western Pennsylvania in the 1790s. That is all about whiskey taxes. If you move forward to the Civil War, whiskey taxes are again going to be very inflicting lots of conflict as well. And whiskey, of course, is going to play a key role in the American Civil War, especially when it comes to medicine. And it may not necessarily be the way that we all think of whiskey in the Civil War. Pop culture, Hollywood has given us a view of the use of whiskey in the Civil War medicinally, that isn't exactly accurate. Whiskey is extremely prevalent on the battlefields during the Civil War in a medicinal form. It is often used in battlefield aid stations. So just behind the front lines of the fighting, there are essentially what we would call medics today. They were hospital stewards and assistant surgeons setting up first aid stations to care for those wounded soldiers coming off the battlefield. They do have whiskey in their kits, and they're giving out essentially small shots of whiskey to wounded soldiers coming into their aid stations. And this is not to dull the pain, to numb pain. Instead, it's actually being used, and the period writers describe it as being used as a stimulant. This is being used in the treatment of shock. They're giving alcohol in a small quantity to give the patient kind of a little bit of a boost, get the blood rushing a little bit, to get them flushed, and the hope being that they could then be transported back to field hospitals for additional care. Whiskey, brandy, other distilled beverages are also in the field hospitals as well, being used in a very similar way. Civil War surgeons will often note after the fact in reports, talk about the use of whiskey just before operating. This is not the way we see it often in Hollywood, though. This is not giving a shot of whiskey, give them a swig out of a bottle, have them bite down on a stick and chop off their arm. Thankfully for the Civil War soldier, that is largely myth. Because anesthesia is available in the operating rooms of the American Civil War. Chloroform and ether are both widely available, widely used. 95% of surgeries performed during the American Civil War were done under some form of anesthesia, either chloroform or ether, or in some cases, a mixture of both. But whiskey was often used in that same way that they used it in the battlefield aid stations. A shot, a little swig before the anesthesia was administered, with the idea that you're going to deal with some of the symptoms of shock that the patient was experiencing after having been struck by a .58 caliber soft lead mini ball that did devastation on the human body. When the patient would wake up from their surgery, oftentimes without a leg or an arm, because amputations were the most common surgery performed during the conflict, again, patient would wake up, get another swig of whiskey, of brandy, of distilled beverage, again, with the thought being it's going to give them a little bit of a boost. Civil War surgeons believing that that's going to lead to higher likelihood of surviving. The way that they're not using whiskey and distilled beverages is in antiseptic ways. There is no knowledge of germ theory. There's no knowledge of what causes infection. There's no research being done about alcohol and how it can clean up wounds, clean hands. That is not yet being utilized in Civil War era operating rooms. So this is those places are really dirty, awful, kind of just as bad as you see them in the movies kind of places. But nevertheless, alcohol continues on. You can follow a patient as they go from the aid station to the field hospital back to general hospitals, which have been developed in major cities during the Civil War. And you will oftentimes see whiskey being used in the day-to-day recuperation of Civil War soldiers who had been wounded or who were sick. So much so that the Confederacy's largest hospital, a place called Chimborazo, just southeast of downtown Richmond, they actually had a distillery and a brewery on site at the hospital. So this is very prevalent. The need for distilled products is very high in these Civil War hospitals, and so it is ever present in these hospital wards, in the field hospitals, in the medical kits of the American Civil War. So from that angle, from Civil War Medicine Museum perspective, we think this is a great opportunity, a great partnership to talk about how Civil War medicine and whiskey and distilled products are all very well intertwined. But it's also important to say that whiskey is involved in many other ways in the American Civil War. You may have heard stories of General Grant and his drinking during the Civil War, and his preferred form of drink was whiskey. You may hear of other generals with whiskey courage out there on the battlefield. And you'll also see there's a fascinating article article I was just looking at before coming online about the insane rise in whiskey prices during the American Civil War, in part tied to the jacking up of taxes on whiskey to pay for the Civil War, but also because demand was so high during the conflict, both in part because the governments were consuming so much whiskey for use on the battlefield in the hospitals of the war, but also because average American is going to be consuming a lot more whiskey as well, in part to cope with some of the issues that they are dealing with during the conflict. So whiskey is intertwined with the history of the American Civil War. And so we at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine are just absolutely thrilled to be able to work with Braeden, the team at McClintock, to have that taste of history, to bring some of these stories to life, to be able to talk about some of these connections between past and present while we're sipping a beverage that's inspired by the Civil War. And quite frankly, of all of the tasting history projects we've done, I think Braeden and his team have done far and away the best job of really trying to stay true to the original product and do the research and do the work that is required to give you a true taste of Civil War era history.
Thank you for that, Jake. And if anyone has any questions about that, about whiskey and the Civil War and such, now's a good time.
I guess one question I was kind of thinking about is Remedy Rye is kind of a rye whiskey, but there's a lot of different types of whiskeys out there. Like based upon I guess the Civil War touching so many different states, areas, regions, was the rye the predominant type of whiskey used?
I will throw that one over to just to see if Braeden, if you have any thoughts on that. I do have a note related to that is in Kentucky with bourbon. One of my favorite distilleries down there in Louisville is Old Forester, and just a Civil War connection with Old Forester is actually named. Forester was a Civil War surgeon, a U.S. Army surgeon from Louisville, Kentucky. So kind of a cool Civil War era connection that they have down there. But Braeden, do you have any thoughts on that one?
I know we have found some old excise reports which don't break down what kind of whiskey it is, but based on the different regions that would have been producing. At that time, it was really like the 1890s is when bourbon really started to take off and surpass Maryland and Pennsylvania. So my bet would be rye would be the most popular form of whiskey at that time. I know based on the numbers, brandy was also very, very common in a lot of places. But in terms of whiskey, it'd probably either be blends or rye bases for the most part, especially just, where the Civil War battles were being fought and the prominence in particularly Maryland and Pennsylvania. That would be my guess, but I don't know for sure what exactly. Corn whiskey was just starting to kind of become popular right about that time. So I'm sure there would have been some of that too.
Yeah, I couldn't break it down any better than that, but yeah, I wanted to make sure brandy got a shout out, because in all the documents that I look at, they're either citing whiskey or brandy. But yeah, I couldn't break it down anymore in any greater detail than that. Any other questions on this subject? Yeah, I think it's such a an interesting thing about Civil War medicine in that, they're more modern than we sometimes give Civil War medicine credit for, but also sort of just as bad as we sometimes think it is. They're not giving whiskey as anesthesia, but they are sort of using it as a stimulant when we know it to be a depressive or a depressant today. And so there are all these kind of, I don't know, contradictions is maybe too strong of a word, but it's fascinating in the early days where, in the Civil War in the 1860s and are the early days of the scientific method being applied pretty rigorously to medicine. Those early days there, you can kind of see them figuring some stuff out, but they also, don't quite figure everything out. So I just think all that's very interesting, and I just wanted to underscore that. Well, without any further ado, I think it's probably time to get to the headliner. You've heard the opening acts; they've been good. You're excited, but now it's time to bring the headliner onto the stage. Go ahead and take us home, Braeden.
All right. And we'll keep it brief because this is really just for fun. If anybody hasn't done a spirits tasting before, I know one or two people that were in it for the history. Generally, when we're doing whiskey, I really like a tulip-shaped glass. This is a Glencairn, but even like a wine glass will do for new whiskey. This does a good job of concentrating the aromatics, which are a big part of evaluating whiskey in this choke point up here. Gives it a little bit more surface area at the bottom to run around. I like to shake it around a little bit, a little oxygen, a little temperature change, get some of those aromatics going, give it a nice smell. And I love the aromatics on this are very spicy. The barrel compounds, that kind of almost caramel note comes through really nicely. It's not as spice forward in the nosing as I get with some other rye whiskeys. And then for tasting, usually for spirits, I'll tell you the American Distilling Institute approved method of tasting, and then I'll tell you how I like to do it, which is they recommend in 3 sips. The first is to basically shock the palate because the human body is not very well equipped to be tasting stuff at this proof. Then the second taste, you let it run from the front to the back of your tongue. And you'll be doing most of the taste notes there. So sweet, savory, spicy, the umami, all of that. And then the last one, you'll switch it around a little bit, and that's for mouthfeel. So is it buttery? Is it thick? Is it thin? Is it watery? Is it soft? All of that. I usually tell people there's no wrong way to drink whiskey. So if you want to shoot it back, you can shoot it back. That's totally okay. But I think we'll be sipping this one. I've been drinking a lot of this in the last few days. It's so good. It's really, really tasty. This one, it's really, really fun with that esterification that we got from that ale yeast. Some of the notes you'll get with this that you won't normally get with the rye whiskey. There's almost like a plum, kind of like dark fruit note on the front end. There's some of those light kind of spice notes on the back, but where sometimes I get like black pepper from rye whiskey. This one almost has like a cardamom taste to it, more of like almost like an Indian spice, which is really, really nice. The vanilla comes through nicely. And I had this with a cube of ice the other day, and with a little bit of water, the bouquet really opens up, and you get almost like a floral nosing to it. It's really, really beautiful. And this, I would love to hear what you guys are tasting, because it was a madhouse in here over the weekend, so I didn't really get to hear a ton of feedback. So I would love to know if you guys like it or what you're tasting.
And just if I could jump in real quick beforehand, and I'm asking this because I'm curious, how this all works. Obviously different palates will probably identify different things, but the more, obviously you're quite literally a professional at this, Braeden, but how does one, how do you get to be able to, identify, all these flavors, both on the palate and, on the nose and things? Is it just as simple as, you just do it enough times and you get better at it, or is there a little bit more to it than that?
I have done a lot of, there's actually classes, you can take nosing classes. I've done a bunch of them, and that is very helpful. But I think the best thing to do is just think of it like similes. So I just read a book on the science of smelling, and it's really interesting the way human beings, you correlate smells and tastes based on something else. So you know I can smell this and you're like, oh, this is 4-methyl glycanol, but really what it is this smells like peppers. This smells like vanilla, and that's coniferaldehyde, and you can slowly kind of build up what that is. But the easiest way, especially if you're new into whiskey, is just try it and think like, oh, this one has a lot of leather in it. It has a lot, like some light tobacco notes. It's really fun to build. Yeah, Rick said there you can get nosing kits on Amazon. Some of which I've had that are pretty good, and some of which are okay. You can go if you go to moonshineuniversity.com. You can order a tasting kit from them that's really excellent. It's from Nancy Fraley. She's probably the best nose in the U.S. for spirits. Anyways.
What a title, best nose
Nancy
in
the
the
nose.
Couple good questions, and also not to take away from Braeden's original question, we'd love to know what you're tasting, what you're smelling, all that sort of stuff. I don't want to get away from that. But Isabel asks, suggestions for cocktails, or should it be only straight?
So I think it's whatever you prefer. We wanted to do this as a sipping whiskey that was meant to be enjoyed either on its own or with a little bit of water. Personally, I go back and forth. Some expressions I like a little bit of water or an ice cube. Some expressions I just kind of enjoy it on its own. But I hear a lot of distillers saying you should only drink this neat, and I think that is not the way to think of it. I think if you have a really good product, you can make some really interesting cocktails and really elevate that product. And so I think I'd say put it in whatever makes you happy.
Which is just I think a delightful thought. Timothy says we had the Remedy Rye as a whiskey sour and it did amazing. So there you are.
Awesome.
And then also to the point of smell, John and Linda say some of it is also genetic. Some people can just pick out flavors and complexities better than other people. And then Anne adds in the helpful note that sometimes it can help to drink different expressions side by side, like the Remedy versus Boot Jack, or whatever else in whatever other situation.
That's the best way to train your palate, is just drink a whole bunch of whiskey.
Right. At the end of the day, just drink a lot.
Yeah.
Well, anyone want to comment on any flavors they're picking up or smells or anything like that? Anne says stimulating. That's right.
I mean, this is definitely fantastic. I have definitely already taken a good dent out of it, so it is a wonderful product. But I definitely will say, like, compared to the Maryland rye, that I also is a very top favorite. Less pepper. You get kind of like a buttery note. I think it's kind of soft, and then you get a nice warmth, not on I think the front, but you kind of get that on the tail.
And I do get the vanilla at the end more so.
Good. Yeah, the barrels we got in for this were really nice. They're packed full of those lignans, which is what gives you the vanilla.
The color is very pretty too.
Yes, John and Linda add definitely the pepper, but also the vanilla. Great stuff. Great stuff. I've only had a sample of this, and I thoroughly enjoyed it when I did have it. And I'm looking forward to getting my bottle later this week. So it's going to be a good time. Anyone else want to chime in, or Braeden, do you have anything you wanna add here?
Oh, that's a great question, and I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about that yet, but we do have a plan. We can talk about it.
Cool. Yes.
So we are we are taking the barrels. They're going to one of my favorite nano breweries, which is Midnight Run Brewing here in town. They are going to do. They're going to keep the collaboration going, and they're going to be doing a collaboration with the museum using these barrels to barrel aged beer, which I'm excited about because I love their beer and I really love their barrel aged beer.
Yeah, this is just such a great opportunity to kind of keep the collaboration going. It's like this, Remedy Rye can live on even after all of the bottles are sold and gone. We can, have another product, another cool local collaboration. I think that's another thing I just want to point out too, is all of those collaborations that we've done with Tasting History have all been in the Frederick community or adjacent communities. Hagerstown is as far as we've gone with those collabs. So we very much are very focused on working together with other businesses in our community to all work together. And yeah, I am a big fan of Midnight Run as well, so I am very much looking forward to what they do with those barrels.
Rick asks a great question. Are there any bottles left for sale?
Unfortunately, there are not. So they went very, very quick. So I know a lot of you guys came out, and I know some people were here at like 10 o'clock to wait in the rain for 2 hours before we opened, who are here tonight. I'm not naming any names. We really, we were just so thrilled. People came out on the kind of cold and dreary day to support the museum and try this stuff and pick it up. And it's, we were really, really lucky. And we've already been in talks to start making this in a larger format that we'll have in another few years.
Yes.
Or maybe we could, it sounds like from what you guys say, we'll just do a collaboration ether this time maybe and just down here.
That's right. Distilled ether. That'll be one for the history books.
It's one of I'll add in one of my favorite stories that I've come across while doing research about Civil War medicine is with the development of ether in the 1840s when they start experimenting with it at medical schools before they start using it in surgery. The college students are using it to get high and are having ether parties in their dorm rooms. So we would be in good company with Civil War era surgeons and doctors.
All right.
Wow. Well, so yes, you all can rest assured and sleep easy at night to know that more is very, very likely going to be on the way, but the downside is it'll be a little while. So yes, it'll get here eventually. So if no one has anything else for the good of the order here, I think we're going to draw the program to a close. I know I had a good time. I had some great questions from everyone. So thank you so much for participating. And this was great.
Thanks so much, everybody. I appreciate it.
All
Yeah, thank
righty.
you guys.
Until next time.